The themes used to analyse question 4 and 5 were developed from a combination of the American Association of School Librarians 21st Century Standards, the Australian Curriculum, ICT, CCT and History, and other prominent comments by the students. This table shows the 5 themes that were developed. These were 1. Skills to organise the inquiry task. 2. Disposition to be engaged in the inquiry task. 3. Searching for information. 4. Selecting relevant information. And 5. Creating the product. The components of each of these themes are in the second column. These were developed by classifying the students' responses. The third and fourth columns give some examples of student responses, which are representative of some of the components. For question 4, the results were as I expected, as they were highly dependent on when the surveys were conducted. For example, in Survey 1, the responses regarding the ease of organising, searching and selecting are all fairly prominent. At the beginning of the task, the anticipation of doing research was in the minds of the students rather than thoughts of creating the essay. Also, in Survey 2, the responses pertaining to the searching for information being easy were most common, as this survey was given towards the end of their independent search phase. And as Survey 3 was given after the creating and evaluation phases were almost complete, the students had recent experience in both synthesising their information and creating the essay, hence why the selecting relevant information responses was so prominent, and also now the creating the product responses are mentioned. Responses pertaining to organisational skills being easy were noticeable throughout the inquiry, although the responses dropped after the students finished their independent search, as difficulties with the elements of research were prominent in their minds, and in particular, problems with saving their files. Responses relating to disposition were mostly insignificant. However, in a later question concerning what they could do to improve their research task, disposition rated very highly. Responses relating to searching for information being easy were high throughout the whole process, as the wording of the question lends itself to responses about searching for information. For question 5, the most interesting result was that the difficulties associated with the disposition to be engaged in the inquiry increased as the inquiry progressed. Perceptions of the task being too hard, too long and boring seem to have influenced some students' ability to engage with the inquiry. Also, some comments expressed the students' frustration and even disdain for the inquiry. This was even more evident in the responses in later questions that specifically asked what could be done to improve the research task next time. Another interesting result is that the number of responses concerned with difficulties in organising the inquiry task increased as the inquiry progressed. A common problem, particularly with the lower ability students, was saving their work. As these students are the last year level in the school to have their own tablet, they are required to use the library computers. Saving their files, including the research booklet or essay, defaults to saving to the desktop, which could not be retrieved the following day. Although they were instructed to save to a USB and email the documents home, for many students this added a level of complexity resulting in lost work and consequently frustration. As expected and consistent with question 4, the most common responses in Survey 2 were difficulties associated with searching, most likely because Survey 2 was given after the students had finished their independent searching. Also consistent with question 4 are the number of responses concerning difficulties with selecting information and creating the product. These increased in Survey 3, and in fact, Survey 3 was the only time students had mentioned any difficulties with the production of the essay. This was due to the timing of the survey, being given just after the students had completed their essay and evaluated it according to the assessment criteria. The responses in all surveys for each theme were added. Here, these responses are compared. The most noticeable difference is that there were more responses, 17%, that pertain to a disposition that created difficulty when doing research, compared with 6% of responses relating to a disposition that helps make research easier. The themes used to analyse questions 6A and B are the same as for questions 4 and 5. However, the response nothing was also prominent, and ways of learning was also a new theme that surfaced. An example response for ways of learning is, I found that the best way I learn is through audio-visual presentations, such as horrible histories. The most interesting results from this are that searching for information did not rate highly on the responses, even though in questions 4 and 5, this theme was a dominant factor in what students found both difficult and easy to do. The other interesting result is that disposition rated very highly, 22% of all responses. This was largely due to students recognising that a positive disposition is required to achieve well in an inquiry, and more importantly, many students felt that they were lacking in this area. 30% of responses related to organisational skills. Students again recognise that being organised is necessary to be successful in an inquiry. Question 6B was intended to enable the students to reflect on how the elements of this inquiry task help them learn. Again, the most dominant responses related to disposition, in particular, motivation, commitment, and work ethic. Also, the ways of learning responses were common, which suggests that some students were beginning to critically evaluate the way that they do research. After analysing the results of Survey 1 and 2, it was evident that some students were struggling with this inquiry. For the lower achieving students, it was clear that they were unable to make connections between the various concepts of this topic, and so more formative feedback by way of questioning was introduced. Small groups were formed to give students a chance to ask the teacher questions and also speak with peers about some of the issues. These students were very hesitant to be involved in questioning, even in small groups, probably because they were unsure and lacked confidence. This has implications for future recommendations to enable students to seek answers to questions anonymously. Many students indicated that they had experienced difficulties with the skills required in the inquiry process. These included researching, recording information, and selecting information. Although the retrieving and processing phases of the inquiry were now complete, this has implications for future recommendations, in particular involving the teacher librarians more in the retrieving phase and assisting students to use the information effectively in the processing phase. The Alberta Learning Model acknowledges that skills and strategies required to do inquiries must be taught. Even though scaffolds addressing these had been covered in class leading up to the inquiry, it was necessary to remind the students of the availability of these scaffolds. Also, optional small group tutorials were arranged in class time that addressed a specific skill. Students could work together on a particular skill. At this stage, the writing of the essay was the skill most students needed help with. For many students, there is an observed high correlation between their achievement and level of organisation. The use of the library desktops has caused considerable trouble for some students in saving their work and managing their files. Next year, these students will have their own tablet, which will alleviate most of these issues. However, in the meantime, the students were reminded constantly about saving their files to a USB and emailing their work home to themselves. Also, advice on naming files by versions or dates was given in the hope that confusion could be avoided. In Survey 3, question 7 asked how the students felt about their research and, as expected, at the end of the inquiry, the majority of students responded that they felt confident about their research. That is, that they think that their inquiry turned out okay. For the track students, the high achievers, student A and B, both responded that they were really happy with how their inquiry turned out. Unfortunately, Both low achievers responded that they were unhappy, not confident, and thought that they may have done the wrong thing with their inquiry. This response is consistent with interviews and other responses to questions throughout the inquiry. These students obviously experienced difficulty with the inquiry, which is reflected by their lack of motivation and poor responses throughout the surveys. For student F in particular, this is consistent with the results of his essay. Question 8 asked the students to reflect on how their feelings towards research have changed. As expected, the majority of students' responses were confident, indicating that at the beginning they were unsure about doing research but now feel better about it. Tracked students B, C and D gave confident in response for this question. Student A gave happy, indicating that at the beginning he felt confident and now he feels even better about doing research. Once again, students E and F gave unhappy as their response. At the beginning, they didn't like doing research and they still don't because they find it hard.